and has had multilateral engagements from NATO, OSCE, the EU, Arctic Council, and so on. So I look forward to a dynamic discussion and look forward to the two of you joining us up here on the stage. Great. Thanks.
Introduction, and thank you so much for having me back here again. It's wonderful to see you all, and we are going to have a great discussion today, so thanks to you as well, Joe. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, senators, members of the House of Commons, General Carignan, thank you so much for being here. I extend a special hello to the Canadian Armed Forces, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, students, whom I believe are in the room as well. Good morning, bienvenue. International visitors, welcome to Ottawa. Comme j'ai dit en anglais, c'est un grand plaisir de vous voir ce matin, comme toujours. Et je remercie Dr. Rivard-Piché et toute l'équipe ici de m'avoir invité de vous parler aujourd'hui. La dernière fois que j'ai pris la parole à cette conférence, c'était il y a 3 ans, comme ministre de la Défense nationale. C'était un temps différent. C'était un environnement très, très différent, difficile, mais différent. Et depuis, le monde a changé beaucoup. Et je dois dire, certains dossiers ont aussi changé, mais pas tout. Aujourd'hui, nous vivons dans un monde qui évolue rapidement. Et le Premier ministre a livré un discours là-dessus. Et je voudrais commencer là. Ça, c'est la fondation, si vous voulez, de mon propre discours aujourd'hui. The Prime Minister, in his remarks at Davos, spoke about the rewiring of the global order. That transformation requires us to think clearly about how Canada protects our interests and contributes to international security at the same time. And so the road to 5%, to use the title and theme of this year's conference, must be understood in the context of the global strategic environment. And at its core, our approach in foreign policy is grounded in a simple idea that we must accept the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And we must act with principled pragmatism to defend Canada's interests while remaining true to our values. This principled pragmatism is at the core of our foreign policy approach in 2026. This pragmatism requires us to recognize and strengthen existing alliances and to form new ones. As the Prime Minister has said, the powerful have their power, but we have something too, the capacity to build our strength at home and to act together. Today, I will illustrate what principled pragmatism means in practice by focusing on 3 areas: Ukraine, the Arctic, and the Middle East. First, Ukraine. Clearly, Vladimir Putin did not expect us to be here 4 years on. When I received that phone call from the Chief of Defense Staff, Wayne Eyre, in the middle of the night 4 years ago, many analysts predicted Kyiv would fall within 3 days. And yet, Kyiv still stands 1,470 days later. Canada's support for Ukraine reflects something fundamental about who we are. We believe in international law. We believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity, and in a world where borders are not redrawn by force. But defending those principles also requires realism. And as President Stubb reminded me on our way out after hearing Prime Minister Carney speak in Davos, he looked at me across the hall and said, "Values-based realism," and then walked away. And it is the theme not only of Prime Minister Carney's speech, but realpolitik in 2026. Defending our principles requires us to be pragmatic. And that is why Canada's approach to Ukraine will continue to be taken not only in terms of domestic responses, which I'll discuss in a moment, but also our work with the Coalition of the Willing, and certainly as a leader in that group. We have renewed Operation Unifier. We've committed an additional $2 billion in military assistance, bringing Canada's total assistance and support to Ukraine to more than $25 billion. Canada, together with like-minded countries, will be standing to support Ukraine in the short and the long term. Our support in Operation Unifier, and just raise your hand if you have participated in any way in training Ukrainian armed forces members. There are people in this room, therefore, and we should give them a hand for standing side by side with Ukraine's armed forces. This has been, in my conversations with leaders all over the world, Canada is known for its work in Operation Unifier, and other countries have rushed to emulate Operation Unifier. It is a leading example of the way in which Canada tangibly has contributed to Ukraine's own defense of its territorial integrity and state sovereignty. It's not just on the battlefield that we've been working on these issues. Ukrainian children are being indoctrinated, kidnapped, taken from their homes in Ukraine back to Russia. And we need to bring those children home, period. We need to bring those children home. And we as a country need to make sure that we do whatever we can to galvanize international support to bring the children to their families, their Ukrainian families. We are also going to be hosting an international conference here in Canada on this very subject in the fall, and I invite you all to come. We are also helping to stabilize Ukraine's energy system, including a $20 million contribution to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund. We are supporting Ukraine's gas imports through a $322 million loan guarantee to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And at the same time, we continue to apply economic pressure on Russia. Canada has imposed more than 4,000 sanctions on Russian individuals and entities. And just last week, I announced 174 additional sanctions targeting individuals and organizations and vessels linked to Russia's shadow fleet. Together with our partners, we are lowering the price cap again on Russian crude oil, and I will say these measures matter. This war is taking a heavy toll on Russia itself and the Russian economy, and Canada will continue to stand with Ukraine in the short and the long term, as I said. Security challenges today, as this illegal and unjust war shows, are connected. And this brings me to my second example of the application of what I call the Carney Doctrine, and that is in the Arctic. Donc, on va parler de l'Arctique maintenant. Aujourd'hui, la compétition entre les grandes puissances augmente. Alors, le Nord devient de plus en plus stratégique. Ce n'est pas une région complètement calme. Les changements climatiques transforment la région rapidement. En même temps, la rivalité entre les grandes puissances change l'environnement de sécurité mondiale. Ces deux réalités se rencontrent donc maintenant dans l'Arctique. Il est clair que la défense de l'Arctique canadien est une priorité de sécurité nationale. After all, more than 70% of our coastline interfaces with the Arctic and 40% of our landmass, which means that when Canadians talk about the North, we're actually talking about more than 1/3 of our country as a whole. And that's why Canada is investing $80 billion to strengthen our military and security capabilities. I stood on this stage in 2023 indicating that our commitment to NATO, 2%, was of the utmost importance. Our investment in the Canadian Armed Forces and in military spend of $80 billion in last year's federal budget must be acknowledged. We have to continue to remember that the Arctic and the work that we will do in building the armed forces and our defense procurements in conjunction with Indigenous peoples is fundamental to the security, the safety, and the protection of our country as a whole. Our investments are strategic as well. We're building NOSHs, Northern Operational Support Hubs, to enable rapid deployments and support northern communities. We are acquiring early warning aircraft and advanced sensor systems to strengthen domain awareness. We're introducing a new fleet of tactical helicopters and establishing a satellite ground station. We're advancing plans for a fleet of submarines capable of operating under the ice. And this is in addition to a number of ongoing procurements, from icebreakers to the AOPS to the surface combatants to the fighter jets. Canada's military growth has tangible support from the federal government. And together, these investments will strengthen Canada's ability to detect threats earlier and respond more effectively across the Arctic. La sécurité dans l'Arctique dépend aussi de la coopération. Canada is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We work closely with our allies to protect the North. And we're reaching 2% of GDP this year and 5% of GDP by 2035. Ça, c'est sûr, mes amis. At the same time, in discussions with NATO partners, including the Nordic Five and Secretary General Mark Rutte, I've emphasized that Canada has long been a net exporter of security to Europe. NATO's focus now must not only be towards the east, but also northward. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, must look northward. And in early February, I opened a new consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, in one of the most poignant moments of my life. And certainly in the context of the geostrategic environment, the opening of that consulate took on new meaning. Canada will also open a consulate in Anchorage. And our work with our allies, with our NATO allies, has to be underscored that there is global competition in the Arctic. The threats are evolving, from climate change to economic threats to strategic and military threats, as, for example, Russian infrastructure moves further and further north towards the Arctic Circle. And responding to these threats requires pragmatic, cooperative action with NATO and with new alliances like the Nordic Baltic countries with whom we are closely collaborating. And we must invest in the capabilities needed to defend our sovereignty. We need to work with and be in close collaboration and consultation with Indigenous peoples, because in today's strategic environment, Arctic sovereignty is not simply declared, it must be demonstrated. Third, and finally, the Middle East. Few regions reflect the complexity of today's geopolitical environment more clearly. Canada has long recognized that Iran remains a principal source of instability in the region. That is why, for over 15 years, Canada has not had diplomatic relations with Iran. That is why we have declared Iran a perpetrator of state terrorism. Canada recognizes that this regime and its proxies have fueled violence and violations of human rights across the Middle East, while continuing to pursue nuclear capabilities and threaten international, not to mention regional peace and security. Despite decades of negotiations, Iran has not dismantled its nuclear program. Canada, therefore, as Prime Minister Carney said yesterday, regretfully supports efforts to prevent Iran from developing and acquiring a nuclear weapon. At the same time, Canada continues to stand with the Iranian people in their struggle against oppression and repression of their human rights. Today, the region faces an evolving crisis and a growing toll on civilians. We call on all sides to respect the rules of international engagement. International law binds all parties. And Canada condemns Iran's attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, certainly in my calls across the region, from Qatar to KSA to UAE to Oman and Jordan, as well as G7 counterparts. I have emphasized that Canada supports rapid de-escalation and remains ready to work with partners to achieve it. We call on all sides to respect the rules of international engagement, and diplomacy remains essential to preventing a wider conflict and protecting innocent lives, and Canada believes in de-escalation and diplomacy. Now, to conclude, across these challenges in Ukraine, in the Arctic, and in the Middle East, a similar principle applies. Canada must approach foreign policy with clear eyes and steady purpose. We must accept the world as it is and act with this principled pragmatism, because security, from economic security to military strength, is the foundation of our work to fortify our country. And these were the thoughts of pure patriotism that overcame me as I raised the Canadian flag at the new consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, at the beginning of February. As the rope hit the flagpole, the crowd was silent until it broke into singing our national anthem. And my heart fluttered as I recognized that we are living in a more dangerous and uncertain world, and our responsibility could not be more clear to defend Canada's sovereignty and to strengthen our alliances. This is our singular task, and we will never divert our gaze away from it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. You gave us such an extraordinary overview of a world that is sort of shattering around us in many ways, that our assumptions have to be challenged, and the clear-eyedness that you've spoken of. I think it resonates so much with this audience. You were talking about being here 3 years ago, and I think back then a lot of people were saying it would help to be clear-eyed, it would help to talk about sovereignty, it would help to talk about interests. We weren't quite at that space, but you've clearly said that we've moved into a new era. So just in terms of time management, we've got about 20 minutes. What I'm going to do is put a few questions or have a conversation with the minister, but I really like to encourage folks to jump in. You can submit your questions through Slido, and I have a little pad here that will tell me, and I will convey them on. But to start, Minister, I'd like to maybe follow your rhythm and your outline. Ukraine. Deep in our hearts for all the reasons you've explained. Can you tell me, you know, from the perspective of both sitting as defense minister but also as foreign minister now, what are the lessons we need to be learning from Ukraine and about Ukraine?
So let me just start with the personal reflection that I feel so fortunate to have been able to serve as the Minister of National Defense and now as Foreign Minister, because I understand more about what our Canadian Armed Forces have been doing and dedicating not only to the effort in Ukraine, but also around the world. And so I come to this role with that understanding generally, but also specifically in the context of the unjustifiable further invasion by Russia of Ukraine in February 2022. And that time, if you'll recall, was very difficult geopolitically. We were very much, and continue to be, but very much focused even before February 24th of that year on how we can support the sovereignty of Ukraine. And so we were seeing the intelligence as early as November, the year before, and I was appointed in November, and the immediate briefings that I was having in the JSAT were about the buildup of Russian troops and aircraft and tanks at the border on the east, in the east of the Donbass, but also in the north in Belarus. And so this was what I came into the post of Minister of National Defense understanding, and certainly the unification within the government but across the country about the need to stand with Ukraine in the short and the long term was unequivocal, and we continue to be unequivocal. The question related to the situation on the ground in Ukraine and how we are going to continue to contribute, but what is the viewpoint from within? And there is a strong understanding that the Russian offensive has taken significant hits in terms of the military capability. They're losing thousands of members of their own armed forces, paying monetary incentives to families to send their sons and daughters to war, calling on their partners around the world to contribute to their military effort. And so the view, and I sat in on a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing for the Prime Minister in Munich because he couldn't make it. The view around the table is that that declining Russian effort and the weakening of the Russian effort must be acknowledged as Ukraine continues to stand strongly. The other point I should mention is the peace plan that has been on the table for some time now, and that Ukraine and members of the Ukrainian government are negotiating. And Canada continually takes the position of supporting the peace plan, supporting security guarantees, but also supporting Ukraine and President Zelensky's own decision-making relating to Ukraine's territorial integrity. That is a decision for Ukrainians themselves to make. And those negotiations are continuing, and I will say that at the same time, President Zelensky has been clear that having the United States at the table in those negotiations is fundamental to the ultimate outcome.
Well, thanks. And as I say, I think Ukraine, it's so good that we're speaking about Ukraine. As we know, there's a tendency to move on to the latest crisis, and goodness knows there's a lot to focus on there. But you know, when we look at the war in Ukraine and we look at what's happening now, we can see the diversity of tools that are used in modern warfare, the hybrid warfare, the asymmetric warfare. And so I'd like to ask you a question that's kind of related to the theme of the conference, and that's about the 5%. And you've laid out very clearly, I think, the stated intent. And I think we all know in this room how lovely it is to get clear direction and guidance that says this is what you're going to do. And actually, you've set out a foreign policy context against which defense implementers can kind of, you know, focus. But I'd like to ask you, Minister, based on your experience in all those portfolios that we heard about earlier, you've done Treasury Board, you've done defense, you know procurement, you know foreign affairs. How are we going to make that pledge real? And I just dig down a little bit farther on that. The Defense Industrial Strategy just came out, very welcome, that's terrific. But what's your message to those who may be, I'll use the term skeptical, but maybe a bit confused? There's a lot of institutions, there's a lot of intent out there, there's a lot of direction, but I'm in industry, how do I connect to this? How do I let you know that you don't have to push me away any longer? We want to respond to that demand signal. Where do we intersect? How do we get it done with the urgency that the government, and you have explained so clearly, requires us to act?
Okay, so first I want to make a fundamental point about the interrelationship between our approach to national security and economic growth in this country. For a long time, the work that is being done in defense and security has been considered to be separate from economic growth and development. With the Defense Industrial Strategy, with the investment of $80 billion into defense and security of this country, with the move to 5% by 2035, we are seeing clearly that it is not accurate to separate economic growth from military investments and indeed strategy. The defense industrial strategy is about activating the small and medium-sized enterprises in this country, as well as larger corporations, to say, we care about this issue, we have a strategy which will pertain to corporations of all sizes, and we will chart international paths for you as contributors to our defense industry in order to grow. And let me give you a key example, which you probably know I'm going to cite, but that's the SAFE agreement in Europe. Canada is the only non-European country to be admitted to the SAFE. That in and of itself is something that we need to underline, because everywhere I go, people are asking me, how did you guys get to be in on the SAFE? We want that. And so what the SAFE does is to say to Canadian companies that you are able to compete for contracts in Europe on the same terms as corporations in European countries. that's a tangible pipeline, if you will, for Canadian companies of all sizes. And our government has actually made that possible. So you can see that there are many lines of effort here. There's domestic growth of the Canadian defense industry, and that will be invigorated with our international relationships. As I said, everywhere I go, people want to contribute and grow in the same direction as Canada is doing right now. We are making the most of a rewired global trading order, and we are making the most of ensuring that we have a leading role internationally with a number of different groups of countries over and above existing alliances.
Thanks, Minister. And that leads me nicely to my next question. But I really do want to encourage folks to jump in. Unless I'm not getting the technology right, I don't see anything here yet. So I'm going to pitch you another one, if you don't mind. But you give me a great pathway to it. You talked about SAFE. I think it's terrific. I want to bring you back to NATO for a second, and you reminded everybody in the room that we're a founding member. I also think it's interesting that a former U.S. Perm rep reminded that the only time Article 5 had been used was actually at the suggestion of the Canadian ambassador, and I happened to be working at GAC at the time, so I recall that well. But I'd like your thoughts a little bit on the future of the alliance. I mean, people are talking about a sort of a NATO 3.0. We see the French looking at sort of a distributed nuclear deterrent. Obviously, there are new dynamics about with the United States. But the security and defense relationship with Europe and with the EU and those partnerships that you and the Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense have been out there developing, I mean, with countries like Sweden and others. Can you tell us a little bit about NATO and our extraordinary alliance and where you think it's going?
Well, I'd first like to underline and thank Minister McGuinty for his work and Minister Blair before him. We have a really strong team, and we are pushing on numerous levers to ensure that we are representing Canada's interests within NATO itself. I'm also consistently struck by the number of questions that I receive relating to change. NATO's changing, the geopolitical environment is changing, Canada's defense and strategic policy is changing, Canada's foreign policy is changing. Yes, change is occurring. We need to get past the recognition that change is occurring, and we need to be focusing on our work collectively for our country in our respective positions, as well as presenting the strongest argument for our country domestically and internationally. And so my mind goes to a recognition of the shifting global strategic environment, yes, but pragmatically, how are we going to address that? So to get to your question about NATO, yes, NATO is responding to the shifting geopolitical environment, especially as the number of conflicts and threats grows. In particular, what we see within NATO is a unified effort to get to 5% by 2035, and countries collaborating collectively within the room at NATO, and then on the sidelines of NATO, individual groupings of countries where it serves our pragmatic interests. And so to use the example of the Nordic Five more specifically, I traveled to Finland last summer for the very reason of accepting the invitation of the Nordic Five to discuss Arctic security with them. And at that table, last August, I raised the point about ensuring that NATO has efforts that are geared towards Arctic security and protection. And my foreign minister colleagues around that table, the Nordic Five, agreed with me wholeheartedly. The question then becomes, how do we put that into action from a NATO context? And that has been the topic of a series of conversations that I have had with Secretary General Rutte, including a conversation that I will have with him today after I have to unfortunately leave this conference. And the point is this: Arctic Sentry is a great initiative, and it's an important initiative, and Canada supports it wholeheartedly. We need that initiative to have a permanent presence in the Arctic, and we also need to see a NATO Arctic strategy that is even more comprehensive than Arctic Sentry. So the question is, how do we move the multilateral alliance that has historically focused its gaze eastward to wholeheartedly recognize that the Arctic is a region that pervades numerous countries and requires a steady, comprehensive, long-term view of NATO strategy.
Thanks, Minister. Well, we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience now, and we have 3 minutes and 25 seconds. I'm going to give them to you in a twosome here. So one is about diversification. And diversification to the EU, but then how do you kind of reconcile, balance, manage that in the context of Canadian firms and long-standing ties with U.S. industry and the United States? And the other one's a little bit sort of a variation on a theme of this, but what's Canada's plan to develop military defense ties, not just trade agreements, in the context of the Indo-Pacific? And obviously you've just come back from the region, particularly with an eye to what the questioner here says, counter an increasingly aggressive China. And obviously there's roads that take us to the Arctic when we talk about China too.
Okay, so you'll recall late 2022, we issued our Indo-Pacific strategy. And I was adamant during the drafting of that strategy that we need to chart a path for security and defense cooperation with like-minded partners, as well as an overall contribution to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I traveled to the Shangri-La dialogue twice to make that point together with like-minded countries. So now flash forward to 2026. That point remains fundamental to our engagement in the region, but over and above that objective, we also have the economic opportunity to cooperate with defense firms in that region, and the opportunity to grow our strategic engagement with countries in the region. And I will highlight, as an example, the work that we are doing with India in the joint statement that Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Modi just issued together. We are working with India in terms of issues relating to domestic security and respect for the rule of law through a dialogue on security.
This game, you're not ready.
That's an ongoing dialogue relating to issues on security in the bilateral relationship. And we have also agreed to undertake a strategic dialogue on defense. That is nascent, but needs to have the contribution of experts, including many people in this room, to grow that relationship. And so I would say that the relationship on security and defense across economic partnerships and across defense and strategic partnerships are not siloed, they're interrelated, and there is room to grow in the Indo-Pacific strategy in order to see those lines of effort continue. We expect and hope to finalize an FTA with the ASEAN in 2026. When we talk about free trade agreements, and certainly your questions touched on diversification, that is the work that the Government of Canada wants to do to create new economic relationships with a host of other countries. And even before Prime Minister Carney came into the role, we have been the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. Since Prime Minister Carney has come into the role, we have signed 12 trade agreements over the past 6 months over 4 continents. But that's just the infrastructure for the economic relationships, which include, of course, defense firms. It is now incumbent upon defense firms themselves to utilize that infrastructure and to see that the government is creating economic pipelines for relationships on defense and security and in other sectors of our economy with numerous other countries. Those efforts need to grow.
Minister, thanks so much. We could have a long, long conversation with you.
Did you say 2 more questions?
I did, but can we have you?
We have one more question, yeah.
We had
I love questions.
Okay, great.
Let's keep
I'm
going.
looking to the organizers. Am I good to go?
First thing in the morning, we're
gotta
all
start.
ready.
I'm being told, yes, you have the time. They have a very tight schedule, but
Okay.
very quickly, it was really about sort of the variable geometry, diversification, whilst maintaining the relationship with the United States.
What's the question?
The question is, how do you do it? How do you do it? The question is, how do you do it? How do you plan to do it?
Okay, first, can we just take a moment, a pause, and talk about terminology? Variable geometry, values-based realism, multilateral rules-based order, these are not terms that one finds in everyday parlance. So, as a foreign minister charged with implementing the foreign policy that the Prime Minister set out in Davos, part of my job is to unpack complex concepts. And hopefully my previous life as an educator and a law professor will come in handy. But I'll say that you're right to focus on the work that we're doing in foreign policy to grow relationships over and above the relationship we have with our largest trading partner. That work includes growing non-US trade and indeed doubling it over the next 10 years. We are doing multiple things in our foreign policy at the same time. We want to see a review of CUSMA in 2026 in order to address sectoral tariffs. At the same time, we have a strong defense and security relationship with the United States. I was in the portfolio of defense when the cylindrical objects were floating above the skies across Alaska. I don't know if General Eyre is here right now, but we had numerous briefings about these, what I refer to as cylindrical objects, and everybody raised their eyebrows. But all that to say that that was an effort that required close cooperation with the United States under the aegis of NORAD. That is fundamental to North American defense and security. Let's not forget that. And so we have a strong economic and security and defense relationship with the United States on the one hand, and on the other hand, we must act pragmatically to grow our relationships with other countries where it is in our strategic and pragmatic interest to do so. So the Nordic 5 example on the Arctic is a good one. The coalition of the willing vis-a-vis Ukraine is another. The ACITI agreement on technology and information, artificial intelligence with India and Australia is another one. These issues are all closely related to security and defense. We cannot separate our economic growth and the necessity to chart a path for economic growth in this country, including through our 10 national projects, from questions of security and defense. They are integrated, and they require us to think holistically, not just about our international relationships to the south and all over the world, but also here at home. And so I'm so glad that many of your questions focused on the defense sector economically and the important work that lays ahead for them.
Well, thank you, Minister. I have to apologize. We've run over time, but it's not often that the Minister
I
says
want it
keep
on the
going.
record that I wanted to stay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's on the
that's
record
great.
for today.
That's terrific. And Minister, you know, I think that it's an understatement to say that when you talk about a coherent, integrated, sustained approach to looking at security and defense with the economic enablers and everything else as a whole of society, whole of economy, sovereignty and interest-based approach to Canada, I think there would be a cheer in this crowd, actually.
So
thank
you know what, Jill, it's so interesting, right? Just as you rely on us in the Government of Canada to do the work internationally and domestically, to grow our defense industry, to chart a coherent and comprehensive short and long-term defense and security strategy and policy, we rely on you to be on the front lines, not just from a military standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. We are working on this together. We are all one Team Canada. And in order to succeed and ensure that this country remains the greatest country on the face of the earth, we have to be in this work together.
Thank you, Minister. Merci beaucoup.
All right, so there you have it. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. Have a good morning.